What would you do if you arrived at the most exclusive bridal boutique in the city, ready for your VIP dress-fitting appointment, only to have a security guard physically block your path and tell you that you weren't on the list? What would you do if your future mother-in-law appeared at the top of the boutique's marble staircase, looked down at you standing on the cold sidewalk, and said loud enough for passers-by to hear, "We can't have trash from the lower classes trying on silk, can we? Security, make sure she doesn't come back." What would you do if your fiancé, the man who'd promised to love you forever, simply turned away and followed his mother back inside without a single word of protest? I'll tell you what I did. I stood on that freezing February sidewalk in Chicago, wearing my wool coat from Target and my practical boots, and I pulled out my phone. Not my regular phone, the other one. The one I'd kept powered off in the bottom of my bag for 2 years. The one with a single contact programmed, labeled simply Home. And I made the call that would bring my grandmother, Her Majesty Queen Beatrice of Savoy, along with her personal helicopter, her royal fashion house, and approximately $40 million worth of consequence, directly to the street corner in less than 20 minutes. But they didn't know that. The security guard, my future mother-in-law, didn't know it. The gaggle of bridesmaids watching from floor-to-ceiling window didn't know, and my fiancé, weak and spineless as he'd revealed him, certainly they were. Let me take you back to, because the beginning, man. The beginning is where I made the choice that led me to this side, this moment, this reckoning. My name, the name I'd been using for 2 years in Chicago, was Lily Bennett. Lily Bennett was 27 years old, worked as a rare book conservator at the Newberry Library, lived in a modest one-bedroom apartment in Logan Square, and took the Blue Line to work every morning with a thermos of coffee and a paperback. Lily Bennett shopped at thrift stores and farmers markets, knew her neighbors by name, and spent her Sundays volunteering at a community literacy center teaching adults to read. My actual is Her Royal Highness Liliana Beatrice Adelaide von Savoria Rothschild, Crown Princess and heir apparent to the throne of Savoria, a small but extraordinarily wealthy European principality whose sovereign wealth fund, carefully managed over 6 centuries, was currently valued $209 billion. My grandmother was the reigning. My late mother had been crown princess, or her death was 12. I was the only heir, which meant that on my 30th birthday, in 3 years' time, I would assume the throne and all the responsibilities that came with it. I'd grown up in Schloss Rothen, a castle with 240 rooms overlooking Lake Savoria, educated by private tutors, trained in 7 languages, presented at courts across Europe. By my 25th birthday, I'd been courted by princes, billionaires, and the sons of presidents. Every single one of them had known exactly who I was and exactly what I represented. Every conversation had been calculated. Every gesture had been weighed for its strategic value. None of them had ever asked me what I dreamed about when I couldn't sleep at, or what books had changed the way I saw, or whether I believed were fundamentally good or fundamentally. I'd gone to my grandmother 2 years ago with a proposal that had sent my security to crisis. I wanted to disappear completely. I wanted to live as a normal person, maybe 3, to see what it felt like to be chosen for my, rather than. I wanted to know if love could exist outside the context of dynasty and duty. My grandmother, who'd married my grandfather in an arranged match that had thankfully evolved into genuine affection, had understood in a way I hadn't expected. She'd looked at me across her desk in the private study, this woman who'd worn a crown for 47 years, and she'd said, "Go, but you'll maintain minimal security, and you'll come home the moment I summon you. No question." Agreed? Agreed, I'd said. So Lily Bennett had been constructed. A complete identity, meticulously documented, with employment history and educational records, and a background that would survive casual scrutiny. I'd moved to Chicago because it was far from Europe and large enough to disappear into. I'd gotten the conservator job through legitimate channels, renting my apartment through normal means, building a life that was, by every outward measure, utterly ordinary. And I'd been genuinely unexpected. I met David Whitmore 14 months into my Chicago experiment at a lecture on medieval manuscript preservation at the Art Institute. He was sitting 2 rows in front of me, asking the speaker intelligent questions about the chemical degradation of iron galling, and afterward, he'd approached me at the small reception, 2 glasses of media. "You look like you were actually interested in the topic," offering. "Most people." "I work with manuscripts," I'd said, "at the Newberry." "So you actually care about 14th century binding." "Passionate," I'd said, and he'd smiled, and that had been the beginning. David was 32, worked in commercial real estate development, and had grown up in Oak Park, in what he described as a comfortable but not wealthy family. His father had been a dentist, his mother a piano teacher. He was smart and ambitious and driven by a genuine desire to improve Chicago's urban landscape through thoughtful development rather than just profit maximization. He took me to neighborhood restaurants and free concerts in Millennium Park. He asked about my work and listened to the answers. He told me about his childhood, his parents' deaths in a car accident when he was in college, his determination to build something meaningful in his life. We saw each other twice a week, then more frequently, then with the natural, unforced rhythm of two who'd stopped counting because they'd stopped. David was thoughtful in ways that felt authentic rather than. He brought me books from his bookstore. He remembered to coffee. When I mentioned offhand that I'd never seen Lake Michigan freeze, he took me to the lakeshore in January, and we stood in the brutal cold, watching the ice formations with our arms around. He proposed on a Saturday morning in my apartment, after we'd made breakfast together and were sitting on my secondhand couch drinking coffee. He didn't have a ring yet, he said. He wanted me to choose it with, but he knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend his life with, and he didn't want to wait another day to. I'd said yes. I'd said yes, because I loved him, because he'd chosen me, believing I was Lily Bennett, with her modists and her Logan School and her student loans. He'd chosen me for out medieval and Sunday morning breakfast, and the way I was terrible. We'd gone ring shopping together the following week to a small independent jeweler in Wicker Park, and he'd bought me a simple solitaire diamond on a platinum band. It cost him $4,000, which represented careful saving. It was beautiful and perfect and meant everything. That was it. And for 8 months, I'd been planning to tell him that. I'd been constructing the conversation, imagining his reaction, trying to find the perfect moment to explain that Lily Bennett was real but incomplete, that underneath the conservator and the Logan Square apartment was a crown princess who would one day rule a sovereign. But before I met him, and his family revealed exactly what David had been hiding, and exactly how much. David's family wasn't. They weren't comfortable but not wealthy. They were Chicago royalty, industrial dynasty wealth going back 4 generations. His father hadn't been a dentist. Richard Whitmore had been the CEO of Whitmore Holdings, a privately held commercial real estate empire that owned half the major buildings in downtown Chicago. His mother wasn't a P. Victoria Whitmore was a former socialite who'd married into the family and had spent 30 years consolidating power and social position with the ruthless efficiency of a military general. David had lied about everything, about his background, his family, his childhood. He'd constructed a false persona just as completely as I had, except his motivation hadn't been to his wealth. It had been to trap me in a relationship before I knew what I was walking in. The first incident happened at a dinner party at the Whitmore estate in Lake Forest, 3 weeks after our engagement. David had told me we were having dinner with some distant relative, nothing formal, just family wanting to meet me. We'd pulled up to a literal mansion, a Georgian revival palace with manicured grounds, and he'd said, as if it were nothing, "Oh yeah, my mom lives here." I probably should have mentioned it's kind of big. Kind of. The house had 27 rooms. Victoria Whitmore greeted us at the door, wearing Chanel and enough diamonds to fund a small school. She looked at me, at my dress from Nordstrom Rack, and my shoes from DSW, and something cold flickered across her face. "So this is Lily," she'd said. "David has told us so little about you. How mysterious." The dinner had been excruciating. David's sister Carolyn and her husband, his cousin Madison and her fiancé, all of them dripping in designer label and old money confidence. They'd asked about my background, with the particular intonation that meant they were really asking about my breeding. Where was I from? What did my parents do? Where had I gone to school? I'd stuck to the Lily Bennett story. Small town in upstate New York. Parents were state school for undergrad, Columbia for my master's scholarship. I'd watched them calculate my worth and find it lacking. Madison had actually laughed when I'd mentioned Logan Square. "Oh my God, take the L. That's so brave. I could never." David had squeezed my hand under the table, but said nothing to defend me. The second incident happened at a charity gala. David had insisted I attend with him, a black tie event benefiting the artist. He'd told me not to worry about finding a gown, that we could rent something. I'd rented a perfectly nice dress from Rent the Runway, a floor-length navy number that had been elegant and appropriate. Every other woman there had been in custom couture. Victoria had taken one look at me and said, just loud enough for several nearby guests to hear, "How resourceful of you to rent. I suppose not everyone has access to personal designers." Madison and her friends had circled like sharks, making comments about my rental, my clearly not designer my lack of recognizable. David's college friend Brittany, a trust fund brat, who'd apparently been in love with him for years, had been the worst. "That's such a cute dress," she'd said, examining me like a specimen. "Very cost-conscious. I always think it's admirable when people make do with." David had been across networking potentially. When I'd found him later and told him how his friends had treated me, he'd said, "They're just not you outside there. Don't take it personal. Just smile and be charming and they'll come around. Just smile," and as if the problem was my failure to perform rather than their active. The third incident was the one that should have ended everything, but I'd been too invested, too hopeful that the David I'd fought was still in there. Victoria had hosted a bridal shower, insisting it was tradition and that she wanted to welcome me. I'd arrived to find 30 women I'd never met, all from the same wealthy Chicago socials, all looking at me with barely concealed disdain. The gifts had been pointed: a subscription to a personal shopping service to help with your wardrobe, a gift to a high-end salon because every bride did, a book on etiquette titled Marrying Up, a guide for the social. That last one had come from Brittany, who'd smiled sweetly while handing it. I'd maintained my composure through 2 hours of thinly veiled insult, and when I'd tried to talk to David about it afterward, he'd said, "They're just trying to help. They know you're not from this world, and they want you to succeed. Can't you see that as kindness? It's not kindness. It's cruelty disguised as concern. You're being oversensitive." And that was when I'd known, really known, that David Whitmore wasn't the man I'd fallen for. He was a coward who'd lied to trap me and was now asking me to shrink and change and accept abuse to make his family comfortable. But I'd stayed. For 3 more months, I'd stayed, because I kept thinking maybe he'd find his spine, maybe he'd defend me, maybe the David from the manuscript lecture would resurface. He didn't. And then came the dress, the final, unforgivable incident that would end this. Victoria had booked the entire VIP floor at Maison Blanche, the most exclusive bridal boutique in Chicago, for a private fitting. She'd invited David's sister, his cousins, Brittany and her wealthy friends, and me. The appointment was for 2 p.m. on a Saturday. I'd arrived at 1:55, wearing my usual clothes, jeans and a sweater, and my practical winter coat. The boutique was on Michigan Avenue, all white marble and crystal chandeliers, and the kind of intimidating elegance designed to make some people special and others feel inferior. I'd walked up to the entrance, where a security guard I didn't recognize, and he'd held up a hand. "Name? Lily Bennett. I'm here for the Whitmore bridal party." He'd consulted a tablet, scrolled, frowned. "You're not on the... I'm the bride," I'd said. He'd looked me up and down, taking in my Target jeans and my non-designer coat, and his expression had shifted to something that looked like pity. "I'm sorry, miss. The VIP floor is restricted to approved guests only. You'll need to leave." "There must be a..." I'd said. "I'm engaged to David Whitmore. This is my dress fit." "Miss, I'm going to need you to step back from the end." That was when I'd heard her voice from inside, Victoria's voice, carrying down the marble staircase. "Is there a problem, ma?" The security guard had turned. "A woman claiming to be the bride, Mrs. Whitmore. She's not on the approved list." And Victoria had appeared at the top of the stairs, resplendent in cream-colored Valentino, looking down at me with an expression of satisfaction. "Oh," she'd said, loud enough that people on the street were turning to. "I'm so sorry. There's been a misunderstanding. The VIP fitting is for family, and darling, you're not In fact," she'd paused, her smile widening, "I'm not sure you ever will be. We can't have trash from the lower classes trying on silk, can we? It sets the wrong tone. Marcus, please make sure she doesn't come back." Behind her, through the boutique's windows, I could see the bridal, Madison and Caroline and Brittany and a dozen other women, all watching this scene unfold, with expressions ranging from shock to barely. And there, in the back, I saw my fiancé, the man who'd asked. He was looking at me through the glass, his face pale, his mouth set in a thin line. He turned away, walked deeper into the boutique, followed his, without saying a single word. I stood on that sidewalk in the cold February, with tourists and shoppers, some of them glancing at me with curiosity or pity, and I felt something inside me go perfect, crystalline, not hurt, not sad, cold. The experiment was over, the farce was done, and it was time for Lily Bennett to stop existing, and for Princess Liliana of Savoria to remind these exactly what happened when you mistook grace for weakness. I pulled out my phone, the secure phone. I turned it on for the first time, and I called my grandmother, Liliana, in the language of our country, the formal Savorian dialect that I hadn't spoken aloud. "I've been waiting. I need extraction," I said. "Full protocol. And grandmother, bring the designers, all of them. I want a dress fit, right here, right now, on Michigan Avenue." There was a pause. Then my grandmother's voice, filled with something that sounded almost like satisfaction. "How many vehicles?" "Enough to block the..." "And grandmother?" "The Whitmore family. Richard Whitmore, his holding. I want every detail of their corporate structure, their banking relation, their debt in everything, within the hour." "Consider it done," she said. "The helicopter is already en route. 18 minutes. I hung up and looked at the boutique, at Victoria, still standing at the top of the stairs, watching with smug suit, at the faces in the window, at the security guard, who was still positioned to keep me out. They had 18 minutes left in their old life. They just did. I took a step back from across the sky was grey and heavy with the threat of snow. The temperature was dropping. I could see my breath and I waited for my grandmother, for the royal house, for the full weight of century to descend on Michigan Avenue. A single expensive 50. Shoppers walked past me, bundled in coats. Cars moved down Michigan Avenue at a steady flow. Inside Maison Blanche, I could see movement. The fitting had begun. Dresses were being brought out. Champagne was being poured. They were celebrating. 12 minutes. My phone buzzed. A text in Savorian from my head of security. "Approach vector secured. Chicago PD has been notified of royal diplomatic movement. Street closure authorized. ETA 9 minutes. 9 minutes. I could see Brittany in the window, wearing what looked like a bridesmaid. twirling for the others. She was laughing. They were all 6 minutes. The sky was getting darker, not from weather, from something else. A low, rhythmic sound was growing steadily. The distinctive thump of helicopter. People on the street were to notice. Starting 3 minutes. The sound was. I looked up and saw it descending through the grey sky. Not a not a tourist. The royal helicopter of Savoria, deep blue with gold trim, the national crest emblazoned on the side, moving with the unhurried certainty of something every right exactly. It landed in the middle of, not near, in it. Traffic. Police cars that had been in advance blocked. The helicopter settled onto the pavement with mechanical precision, rotors still turning, and the door opened. My grandmother emerged first. Queen Beatrice of Savoria, 81 years old, dressed in a charcoal wool coat and pearls, moving with the upright bearing of someone who had never bowed to anyone. Behind her came her private secretary, her head of security, and 6 royal guards in ceremony. And behind them, being unloaded from a second helicopter that had landed immediately after the first, came 3 large cases and 5 people I recognized immediately. The design team from Maison Rothenberg, the royal fashion house that had dressed Savorian royalty for 200 years. They weren't going into the boutique. They were setting up on the street, right there on Michigan Avenue, directly in front of Maison Blanche. They were assembling a mobile atelier. Privacy screens, a carpet, lighting was positioned. Within 90 seconds, they'd created a private fitting more luxurious than anything inside the boutique I'd been banned from. My grandmother walked directly to me, and when she reached me, she did something she'd never done in public. She pulled me into, "My darling," she said in Savoy. "Are you all?" "I'm perfect," I said. "Now." She pulled back, held me at arm's length, examined my face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd governed a nation for nearly half a century. "Show me who did." I turned and pointed at the boutique, at Victoria, who was now at the window, her face pressed against the glass, her mouth open in an expression of dawning horror. "The woman in cream," I said. "Victoria Whitmore, and her son, my former fiancé, who's somewhere inside, and who allowed this to happen." My grandmother's expression didn't change. She simply turned to her private secretary, a man named Henrik, who'd served our family for 30 years, and said in English, loud enough to carry, "Henrik, the Whitmore file, now." Henrik opened a leather portfolio and began reading in a clear carrying that was obviously meant to be heard by everyone in the vicinity, including the growing crowd of onlook and the people inside the boutique. The Whitmore family holdings are controlled by Whitmore Holdings LLC, a privately held corporation with significant commercial real estate assets in the Chicago metropolitan area, primary banking relationship with First Continental Bank of Illinois, outstanding corporate debt of approximately $470 million, secured by property. The family's personal wealth is estimated $800 million, though much of that is illiquid and tied to the corporate structure. My grandmother and First Continental Bank. Who owns it? Majority ownership is held by and Midwest, a consortium of investors, including several pension institutional holders. The controlling stake, 38%, is held by the Savorian Sovereign Investment Authority. My grandmother smiled. It was not a warm smile. "How convenient. Henrik, place a call to the SSIA. I want First Continental's board convened within the hour, and I want the Whitmore debt portfolio review extreme press." She turned back to me. "Now, my darling, let's get you a proper dress. Something that will photograph beautifully when this moment inevitably appears in every major publication." The design team was already unpacking the cases. Gowns emerged, each one a master, silk and lace and embroidery that represented thousands of hours of artisan. These weren't dresses you could buy. These were dresses that were made for royalty, each one cut, each one unique. The head designer, a woman named Margot, who'd dressed 3 generations of Savorian royals, approached and curtsied. "Your Highness," she said, "we've brought 12 options based on your measurements from your last fitting 2 years ago. Shall we begin?" I looked at the faces pressed against the window, at Victoria, who was now on her phone, clearly making frantic, at the crowd that had gathered, phones out, filming every. "Yes, let's begin." And right there on Michigan Avenue, in a mobile atelier set up on the street, I began trying on gowns that cost more than most people's houses, while my former fiancé's family watched from a boutique that had banned me 20 minutes earlier. The first dress was silk duchesse satin with a cathedral train. The second was French lace over silk charmeuse. The third was embroidered with freshwater pearls in a pattern that had taken 4 artisans 6 months. My grandmother sat in a chair that had been produced from somewhere, watching with the expression of a woman who was deeply, profoundly satisfied with how this afternoon was. And inside Maison Blanche, through the windows, I could see chaos beginning to unfold. Victoria was at the window gesturing frantically at someone inside, her face no longer smug, but I watched as David appeared beside her, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something that looked like physical illness as he finally understood what was happening on the street below. He saw the helicopter, the royal crest, The guards in ceremonial. His eyes found me standing in the mobile atelier, wearing a gown worth more than his family's Lake Forest mansion, and I watched the full realization crash over him. His mother was shouting something at him, pointing at me, her mouth moving rapidly. Even from across the street, I could read the panic in her movement. The boutique staff had all stopped what they were doing and crowded the window. The bridesmaids, Madison and Caroline and Brittany, and all the others who'd spent months making me feel small, were pressed against the glass with expressions ranging from shock to absolute terror. Margot, the head designer, was adjusting the fourth gown, a masterpiece of ivory silk file with hand-embroidered gold thread forming a pattern of intertwined roses, the symbol of the Savoorian royal house. This one is magnificent. The cut emphasizes your shoulders beautifully. Very regal. I'll take. And the lace and the pearl embroidered. All three, Your Highness. All three. I'm not sure which event I'll ship them to the palace. Of course. My grandmother's phone rang. She answered it, listened for a moment, then spoke in crisp, authoritative tones. Yes, I understand. No, there will be no reconsideration. The decision is final. Inform them that all credit facilities are to be reviewed immediately and that any covenant violation are to be strictly enforced. No exception, no grace period. She hung up and looked at. That was First Continental's, very apologetic, very eager to explain that they had no idea the Whitmores had offended Savory. I told him I didn't care about it, only his action. Henrik approached portfolio. Your Majesty, I have the details you request. The Whitmore debt structure. They've been operating on what? Their debt-to-asset ratio is approximately 0.68, which is sustainable in good markets, but extremely vulnerable to any disruption in their credit availability. How vulnerable, my grandmother? If their primary credit facility were called or not renewed, they would have they could potentially find alternative financing, but given the size of their obligation and the current banking climate, it would be difficult and expensive. Make it impossible, my grandmother said. I want calls made to every major bank in Chicago. The Savoorian Sovereign Investment Authority has influence in most of them. I want it known that the Whitmore family is not to be extended credit under any and Henrik, make sure it's understood. Yes, Your Majesty. Across the Victoria had disappeared from the window. Moments later, the boutique's front door opened and she emerged, clearly intending to come across the street. She made it 3 steps before 2 of my grandmother's security detail moved to intercept her, positioning themselves in a polite but absolutely unmovable barrier. I need to speak to Victoria, her voice carrying across the street. Her Majesty the Queen is not receiving visitors, the senior guard said, in his accent placing him as Scandinavian, his tone placing him as someone who had ended conversation 1,000, but I didn't know. I had no idea. That is not Her Majesty's concern. Victoria's face was doing complicated, cycling through emotion too rapidly. Please, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. My son is engaged to Lily. We're going to be family. There is no engagement, my grandmother said, her voice cutting across the distance between us with the precision of a blade. She didn't raise her voice beyond what was necessary to be heard. She simply spoke, and Victoria stopped mid-sentence as if she'd been physically struck. My granddaughter, my grandmother, was conducting what we call a verification. She wanted to know if your son could love her for herself rather than her position. He failed, catastrophically. You ensured he would fail by creating an environment so hostile that no relationship could survive it. The engagement is ended. You are not family. You will never be. But they love each Victoria. And there was desperation. The desperation of someone watching something slip away and finally understanding its value. David, he made a mistake, but he loved. David, I said, speaking for the first time directly to Victoria, allowed his mother to physically bar me from a building. He stood inside and watched me be humiliated on a public street. He chose you over me in the most definitive way. That's not love, that's coward. I stepped out of the mobile atelier in the gold-embroidered gown, and I walked toward the barrier where he stood. The guards shifted to allow me through while still blocking. You wanted to know if I was good enough for your family, I said. You spent 8 months testing me, insulting me, trying to break me down and prove I didn't belong. You threw etiquette books at me and rented dresses in my face. You made sure every person in your social circle knew I was beneath you. Victoria's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The irony, is that I was testing you. I was testing whether David could stand up to you, whether he had the spine to choose love over social, whether he was the man I thought he was, or the man you raised him. He's the latter. Congratulations. Behind Victoria, David had emerged from the booth. He looked broken, diminished, standing on the steps in his designer clothes that suddenly looked like a costume. Lily, he called. Please, let me explain. There's nothing to explain, I said. You lied about. You brought me into your knowing they, and when they did, you stood by and watched, confronting. You're not the man from the manuscript. You never were. That was just another. I was trying to, by lying, by giving us such a fall in love, or the money complicated. The money isn't your cowardice. I turned back to my grandmother's security. I'm done here. Let's go. But I wasn't quite done. There was one more thing I needed to see. Henrik appeared at my elbow with his tablet. Your Highness, I thought you might find this interesting. First Continental Bank has just issued a formal notice of covenant to Whitmore Holding. The review will take approximately 30 business, during which time all credit facilities are frozen pending client's verification. What does that mean in practical terms? I asked, though I knew the answer. It means they can't access their operating lines of credit. They can't borrow against their property. They can't finance new acquisition or refinance existing debt. They can continue operating on whatever cash they have on hand, but any transaction requiring bank and their cash position, Henrik consulted. Based on our intelligence, they typically operate with minimal cash reserves, using their credit facilities to smooth cash flow between property acquisitions and disposals. I'd estimate they have perhaps 30 days of operating capital. So in 30 days, when the review concludes, what happens? If the bank finds any covenant, which they almost certainly will if they look carefully, they can call the debt. All 470 Whitmore Holdings would have 30 days to pay or enter default. I looked at Victoria, who had clearly heard every word of this conversation. Her face had gone from panic to something approaching. You wanted me out of your family because you thought I wasn't good enough. You thought I was poor, grasping, beneath you. You were so focused on my target G and my Logan Square apartment that you never asked You never wondered why a conservator with a master's from Columbia was working at one of the most prestigious rare book libraries in the world. You never questioned how I had access to texts that most scholars never see. You never thought to Google my name with the right search term. I pulled out my phone, opened a browser, and typed Princess Liliana Savoria into the search. I turned the phone around to show her the screen. Images filled the results. Me at 18, in a tiara, at my debut ball. Me at 21, cutting the ribbon at a children's hospital in our capital city. Me at 23, standing beside my grandmother at a state dinner, wearing the Savoria sapphire parure, a jewelry valued at $32 million. I wasn't trying to marry up, Victoria. I was trying to marry down. I was trying to see if your son could love a woman rather than a title. He couldn't, and you made absolutely certain he couldn't. I handed the phone to Henrik and turned back toward the mobile atelier, where Margot and her team were carefully packing the gowns into specialized travel kits. That's when David did something I hadn't expected. He broke past his mother and ran across the street, dodging traffic, reaching the security perimeter before the guards could fully react. He stopped when two of them stepped forward, but he was close enough now that he could speak without shouting. Liliane, whoever you, he said. And there were I know I should have been stronger, but everything. I looked at this man I'd shared breakfast and walked through cold meat and kissed in the doorway, at the man who'd asked me to marry him on a Saturday. You love the idea, I said. You love Lily Bennett, the grateful girlfriend who impressed by your success and fit neatly. You don't even, because the real me would never accept being treated. I'll do better. I'll stand up to I'll cut her off completely. Just give me You had 8 months of chances, I said. You had hundreds of opportunities. You chose wrong every single time. Why would the next time be different? Because now, I know who you, and there it was. The fundamental truth that ended everything. Exactly. Now you know who now you know what and suddenly, you're willing to stand up to fight for me, to do all the things you couldn't do when you thought I was nobody. That tells me everything I need to know about what you actually value. I turned to the guards. We're leaving. Lily, please, my name is Liliana, I said without turning back. Lily Bennett doesn't exist anymore. She never really did. My grandmother was already being escorted back to the helicopter. The design team was loading the gown case, and Henrik was coordinating the security. I walked across the carpet they'd rolled out on mission, past the privacy screens, toward the helicopter that would take me back to my... Behind me, I could hear Victoria on her phone, her voice high and desperate, clearly talking, trying to explain what it meant. I could hear Brittany, the other bride, their voices sharp with shock. And I climbed into the helicopter beside my grandmother, and as the door closed and the rotors increased speed, I looked out the window one last time at the scene. David was still standing at the security perimeter. Victoria was on her phone, gesturing frantic. The crowd of onlookers had grown to nearly 100, all filming, all witness, all posting to social in real time. The boutique staff at the window, and there, being loaded into a black S, were the 3 gowns, each one worth more than the entire VIP. The helicopter lifted. Chicago spread out, the late afternoon sun breaking through. My grandmother was on her phone speaking in rapid Savorian, giving instructions about the Whitmore situation, about managing the media coverage, about coordinating my return to the palace. She finished her call and looked at, How are you feeling? Relieved, I said, and angry, but mostly relieved. Good. Anger is useful. It clarifies, but relief is better. It means you've made the right. Did I asked. Or did I just destroy a family because my pride My grandmother's expression sharpened. Your pride wasn't hurt. Your dignity was violated. There's a difference. Pride is dignity is the fundamental respect that every human being deserves, and that royalty has both the right and the defend. That woman physically barred you from a bill. She called you trash. She did it publicly, deliberately, cruelly. The fact that you're royalty simply means you have the reason to respond appropriate. Anyone would respond. Most people simply can't. But destroying their business, we're not destroying their business. We're reviewing their debt covenant. If they're in compliance, they'll be fine. If they're not, they'll face the consequences that any debtor faces when they violate the terms of their agreement. The only difference is that they'll face those consequences now, while it's inconvenient, rather than later when it might be convenient to let violations slide. She paused, looking out the window at the city falling away below. Liliana, you're going to be queen one day. You need to understand something fundamental. It's not about revenge. It's about consequence. People like Victoria Whitmore have spent their entire lives insulated from consequence. They can be cruel because cruelty costs them nothing. Our job, as people with actual power, is to make sure cruelty costs exactly. That's not revenge. That's justice. What's going to happen to them? I asked. Henrik leaned forward. If I may, Your. Based on the preliminary review, Whitmore Holdings has several minor covenants that would normally be overlooked in standard banking. Late filings, minor reporting discrepancy, that sort of thing. The bank will likely use these to justify a full restructuring of their credit facility with less favorable terms. They won't be bankrupted, but they'll be significantly constrained. They'll have to sell assets, scale back operate, potentially bring in outside investors, which will dilute family control. So they'll survive, but they'll never be the same. Precisely. My grandmother, a proportional response. They tried to humiliate a crown princess. They'll lose their position in Chicago society and their comfortable financial, but they'll still have their health, their freedom, and enough money to live comfortably, if not more mercy. She was right. I knew she, but there was still a part of the Lily Bennett that had lived for 2 years in Logan Square and taken the blue line and believed in the fundamental goodness that felt uncomfortable with scale of. I loved, I said, how did I not see? Because you were looking, my grandmother. We all do. We all construct narratives about the people we love that are more generous than reality can sustain. You're not foolish for having hoped. You're human. The helicopter flew on through the clearing sky. Below us, I could see the suburbs giving way to farmland, the landscape opening up as we headed to the private air, where the royal jet was waiting to take us back. My phone buzzed, a text from a number I didn't recognize. This is Sarah from the new. I just saw what. Also, are you really also, does this mean you're not? I smiled, despite Sarah with the work at the kids at, not everything. I typed, I'm okay, I'll come. Another text, this one from my father's. His Majesty sends his love and asks that you call when you're. He's concerned but not angry. He says, and I quote, sometimes you have to burn down the forest to see which trees. That sounded. The jet was waiting, royal blue with gold trim, the Savoorian crest on. The crew was assembled on the tarmac in formal uniform. As I descended from the helicopter, they bowed in unison. I was home, not literally yet, but spiritually. I was back in the world where people bowed, where my title preceded my name, where I was never just Liliana, but always Her Royal Highness. It felt strange years away, but it also felt right. The flight back to Savoria took 9 hours. I spent most of it sleeping, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day. When I woke, we were beginning our descent into the cap, and I could see the palace through the window, Schloss Rothenburg, on its hill overlooking the lake, exactly as I'd left it. My father was waiting on the tarmac. He pulled me into an embrace the moment I was off the plane. My fierce girl, he said. I'm so proud of you. For what? For getting my heart broken, for standing up for yourself, for knowing when to walk away, for understanding that grace doesn't mean accepting. He pulled back to look at me. Your mother would have too. My mother, dead 16 years now, but still present in every important moment. I thought about what she would have said about David, about Victoria, about the scene on Michigan Avenue. She'd have had choice words about all of it. The next weeks were a blur of catching up on royal duties I'd neglected, of formal welcomings back to court, of debriefings with various government ministers who'd been concerned about my safety during the sabbatical. The media coverage was, as expected, intense. The video of the helicopter landing on Michigan Avenue had gone viral globally. Photos of me trying on gowns in the mobile had been on the cover of every major publication in Europe. The narrative had formed quickly and decisively. American socialite family humiliates secret, faces devastating royal retribution. It wasn't entirely accurate, but it was close enough. 3 weeks after I returned home, Henrik brought me the final report on the Whitmore. First Continental completed their review, he said. They found sufficient covenant violation to justify restructuring the Whitmore debt on significantly less favorable terms. Interest rates have been increased, payment schedules accelerated, and additional collateral requirements imposed. Whitmore Holdings has been forced to sell 4 properties to meet the new terms. The family's net worth has declined by approximately 20%. And social, they've been quietly excluded from several. The optics of having offended foreign royalty proved too toxic for most. Victoria Whitmore resigned from the art and the lyric opera. Both resignations were described as voluntary, but were, according to our sources, strongly encouraged. And David, he's attempting to rebuild the business with outside investors. He's no longer speaking to him, according to social media. He posted a public apology addressed to you approximately 2 weeks ago. It's been viewed 4 million times. I didn't see. Would you like to? No, I said. It doesn't matter what it says. And it didn't, because David Whitmore had shown me exactly who he was in the moment that mattered, and no apology could change that fundament. 6 months later, I attended a state dinner in Vienna. The Austrian Chancellor and half the crowned heads of Europe were in attendance. I wore the gold-embroidered gown from Michigan Avenue and the Savoria sapphire parure, and I spent the evening discussing trade policy and cultural exchange programs with people who'd known me my entire life. After dinner, a young man approached me, a prince from a minor European house, educated, intelligent, and polite. He asked if he could write to me, if perhaps I might visit his country later in the year, if I might be interested in getting to know him better. I told him I'd think about it, because I would, eventually, when I was ready to. But this time, there would be no deception, no Lily Bennett, no pretending to be anything other than what I was. If someone wanted to know me, they would know all of me from the start, the tiara, and the title, and the $214 billion. And if they couldn't handle that, they could walk away before any. True power, I'd learned on a cold sidewalk Chicago, isn't about the size of your fortune, or the number of helicopters you can summon, or the speed with which you destroy someone's social standing. True power is knowing exactly what you deserve and refusing to accept anything less. It's standing in the cold while people laugh at you from warm windows and knowing with absolute certainty that the laughter will stop, the windows will shatter, and justice will arrive with rotors spinning and queens descending. It's teach that cruelty has consequences, that dignity matters, that you should never, ever mistake someone's grace. Victoria Whitmore learned that. David learned that lesson. And I learned my own lesson, that love without comfort isn't love, it's just comfort, and comfort isn't worth a crown. What did you think of this absolutely devastating story of royal retribution? Did Victoria Whitmore get exactly what she deserved when the Queen's helicopter landed in the middle of Michigan Avenue and the princess she'd banned from a boutique purchased 3 gowns worth more than? Did you feel the satisfaction when the Whitmore family's banking relationships evaporated and their social crumbled because they made the fatal humiliating? Was powerless? If you loved watching entitled elitists learn that the quiet woman in Target jeans was actually royalty with the power to reshape their entire world with a single phone call, then smash that like button right now, share this with everyone who's ever been judged by their appearance, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of hidden crowns, perfect karma, and the moment when people mistake kindness for weakness, learn exactly how wrong they were. Drop a comment telling me what you would have said to David when he tried to apologize, because I think we all know some mistakes are too expensive to, and some lessons have to be learned the hardest way.